A white man snatched a black CEO's seat and told him to sit in the back. Minutes later, the CEO's private jet pulled up outside, and the whole gate went silent. He thought stealing a seat would steal someone's dignity. He didn't realize the man he pushed aside didn't need a seat. He owned an entire fleet. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always finds turbulence. You're in my seat. The voice cut through the calm hum of the boarding cabin like a hammer on glass, sharp, entitled, and loud enough to draw glances from the surrounding first-class passengers. Derek Langston looked up from his open laptop, his fingers momentarily frozen above the keyboard. The man standing in the aisle was tall, silver-haired, and wrapped in a bright white suit that shimmered faintly under the overhead lights. A red tie knifed down the center of his chest. His cologne arrived a second before his attitude, heavy and uninvited. "I believe this is 2A, Derek said evenly, his voice calm and unshaken. The man scoffed and immediately extended his phone, the screen angled like a badge of truth. "I paid for 2A. You people always try to upgrade yourselves," he added, loud enough to be heard in both rows behind him. Derek didn't blink. His tone didn't rise. He didn't even look at the phone. Instead, he let the silence stretch. A flight attendant approached, young, sandy-haired, and visibly nervous as he glanced between the two men. The woman at the galley looked over, uncertain if she should intervene. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" the attendant asked gently, directing the question toward the man in the white suit. The man didn't move. "Why?" he barked, chest puffing slightly. "Look at me. He clearly doesn't belong here." That line hung in the air like a dropped weight. A subtle shift occurred among the passengers, a raised eyebrow here, a muttered breath there. Someone paused while stowing a carry-on. A man in 3D leaned back ever so slightly to watch. Still seated, Derek slowly reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his own boarding pass. The attendant took it, scanned it, then tapped his tablet to confirm. "Mr. Langston has a verified seat," he said carefully. Then turning to the man still looming in the aisle, "Sir, your assigned seat is 4C. The stranger's jaw clenched, nostrils flaring. His face turned a dull red, not from embarrassment, but from something older, something less dignified. "Whatever," he muttered, and without offering so much as a glance of apology, he hauled his leather briefcase into the overhead bin directly above Derek. The bag slammed into place harder than it needed to. Then, to everyone's surprise, he dropped into seat 2B, the empty seat beside Derek, uninvited. Derek's fingers resumed typing, but his eyes had stopped reading the screen. The incident, though brief, had shifted something. Not just in the air, but in the tone of the journey. The man huffed and reclined his seat prematurely, bumping Derek's elbow in the process. "Better get used to tight quarters," he mumbled. Derek closed his laptop, not abruptly, but with quiet finality. His mind wasn't rattled, only recentered. He had known men like this before, men who barked louder the emptier their reasoning was. Men who carried suits like armor and power like it owed them something. Across the aisle, a teenage boy watched curiously from the window seat. His father, a soft-spoken man in a tweed coat, leaned over and whispered something in the boy's ear. The boy's eyes widened. The jet bridge door closed behind the last passenger, and the overhead lights dimmed slightly as the cabin prepared for takeoff. But inside seat 2A, a storm had already begun brewing, one not of noise, but of calculation. Derek didn't need to react with volume. He'd learned long ago that some lessons echo louder in silence. The man in 2B tugged at his seatbelt and muttered again, this time to himself. But Derek caught it. Enjoy it while it lasts. He didn't rise to it. He didn't shift. He didn't blink. Instead, he thought of the deal waiting in Faro Heights, of the assistant tracking his Gulfstream on standby, of the millions in valuation riding on the hours ahead. But more than that, he thought of the way power sometimes entered a room quietly, even as others tried to shove it out with words. Derek adjusted his cuff slightly, the face of his watch catching the cabin light. He didn't look at the man again. He didn't have to, because he already knew. Sometimes disrespect doesn't need a reason. It just needs an audience. The cabin settled as pre-boarding announcements crackled through the speakers, their familiar chimes slicing through the subtle hum of passengers adjusting seatbelts and overhead vents. Derek Langston sat still in seat 2A, his hands calmly folded over one another, his posture composed but alert. He had already tucked away his briefcase, his laptop powered down, screen still faintly reflecting the cabin lights. Beside him, the man who had earlier tried to claim his seat shifted noisily in 2B, legs splayed, elbows wide, as if space itself bowed to his entitlement. "Unbelievable," the man muttered, loud enough to be overheard, though his eyes remained fixed on his phone. "These airlines don't know how to treat real customers." His name, Derek would later learn, was Trevor Cale. But at that moment, he was just another overconfident voice vibrating with self-importance. Derek gave no reaction, his gaze steady on the seat back in front of him. Years of navigating boardrooms taught him the value of measured silence. Cale shifted again, reclined his seat with an abrupt jerk that startled a passenger behind them, then snapped his fingers at a passing flight attendant. "Sparkling water. Cold. Not whatever temperature you people think is acceptable," he barked. The attendant, a young man with a clean uniform and a tight smile, nodded and retreated quickly. Derek's right index finger subtly tapped the side of his smartwatch, initiating the record function. Not out of paranoia but precaution. He had learned long ago that power often reveals itself in moments of supposed anonymity. Across the aisle, a boy, no older than 10, watched him curiously. His father leaned in, whispering just loud enough that Derek caught it. "That's Derek Langston," the man said, his voice carrying reverence. "He built those hybrid turbines, the ones they use in the new solar cruisers." The boy's eyes widened. Cale, of course, overheard. He chuckled, a low, dismissive laugh, and shook his head as if the air itself was foolish. "He probably built them with a YouTube tutorial," he said, voice dripping with mockery. The father quickly looked away, shielding his son from the tension beginning to rise like static between metal rails. Derek shifted slightly but said nothing. Cale turned toward him, leaning in just enough to breach personal space. "Tell you what, boss man," he said, voice oiled with sarcasm. "Since you're clearly wealthy enough to own a little toy company, why don't you take a later flight? Let real people sit up here for once." Derek turned to look at him directly for the first time. His eyes, dark, steady, and calm, held the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be felt. "Do you know what real power is?" he asked, voice quiet but firm, as if inviting Cale to listen closer rather than respond louder. Cale rolled his eyes and smirked, brushing invisible lint from his lapel. "Yeah, the sitting in seat 2A before someone who looks like you does." Derek didn't flinch, but in the seconds that followed, the atmosphere of the cabin shifted. Passengers nearby turned ever so slightly in their seats. The hum of idle conversation dulled. Someone in row 1 paused mid-sip of his drink. The same flight attendant from earlier returned, carrying the bottle of sparkling water, his smile more forced now. "Mr. Langston," he asked gently, "is everything okay?" Derek nodded once. "Perfectly. Just observing a delayed lesson in manners." The attendant hesitated, as if unsure whether to say more, then offered a nod and turned away. As he passed the boy across the aisle, he caught the child's eye and gave a reassuring glance. But even the child could tell something in the air had thickened. Cale leaned back in his seat, snorting under his breath. "You're lucky people let you sit here," he muttered, not even trying to hide it this time. "I'd have had you moved in another airline." He didn't notice that a passenger 2 rows behind had also started recording. Derek remained motionless, but his mind, always calculating, noted everything. Cale's voice, the timestamp on his smartwatch, the growing awareness among the cabin. He didn't need to retaliate, he only needed to hold his position. "Look at this," Cale said again, gesturing vaguely as if seeking validation from others. "Guy probably donated his way into first class." No one responded. In fact, several passengers now angled their bodies away from Cale, an unspoken choreography of quiet rejection. The boy across the aisle looked back at Derek, curiosity mixed with something deeper, wonder. Derek offered the boy a small nod, barely a movement, but one that said everything. I see you. I hear you. You matter. Cale, oblivious to the shift in tide, sighed dramatically and reached for his phone again. Guess I'm sitting next to a celebrity. What a treat. The lights above dimmed slightly as the plane taxied. Outside, the early dusk cast long streaks across the tarmac, orange and purple slashing through cloud cover. Inside, the pressure wasn't from altitude, it was from something heavier. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was watching, judging, recording. Derek adjusted his cufflinks, slow and deliberate. Not for style, but for grounding. He didn't just want the seat, he wanted to feel above me. The glass trembled in Jerome's hand as the plane jolted again. Light turbulence swept through the first-class cabin, clinking ice cubes and muting idle conversation. Cale, oblivious to the shifting air pressure, waved a dismissive hand. I said bourbon, not whatever this is, he snapped, thrusting the glass back toward Jerome. Do you people even listen? Jerome, mid-30s and composed, took the glass without flinching. His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. I'll see what I can do, sir. As he turned, his eyes met Derek's for a brief moment. An unspoken apology etched into the silence. Derek gave a slight nod in return. It wasn't the first time he'd witnessed Grace wear a uniform and carry shame that wasn't its own. Cale leaned back in his seat with a huff, muttering loudly enough to be heard. Service in first class is getting worse every year. No wonder people fly private. His phone buzzed, and he lazily flipped it over. A message lit up. Cale read it, then chuckled, low and cruel. Bet your company couldn't survive without charity, he said, tossing the words out like a challenge, not aimed at anyone directly, but clearly intended for Derek. Derek didn't blink. Instead, he slowly reached down to the leather case beneath his seat, deliberate in his motion. He pulled out a folded document, neat and pristine, and placed it on the center armrest between them. You might find this educational, he said without turning his head. Cale stared at the paper, confused. But curiosity got the better of him. He picked it up, unfolded the top third, and began reading. His eyes scanned the page once, twice, then locked onto the bold type at the top. Confidential. Ariantech. Stelvor merger approval. Executive summary. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. You, he whispered. You're that Derek Langston? Derek finally turned to face him. No smile. No smagnis. Just a calm nod. Cale's spine stiffened. He looked around the cabin instinctively, searching for some form of allyship, but the atmosphere had changed. Passengers weren't whispering anymore. They were listening, watching. The boy from across the aisle had turned in his seat, wide-eyed again. The man beside him leaned forward, murmuring something too low to hear. Cale's face flushed, color draining to red, then pale. The phone in his hand suddenly felt heavier, useless. The turbulence outside had calmed, but inside the cabin, tension rippled like a current. You're actually, I thought, Cale stammered. You thought wrong, Derek said quietly, voice as steady as the engines beneath them. Cale shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie, glancing toward the galley like he might escape down the aisle. But no one was moving. Even Jerome lingered in the background, half hidden behind the curtain, silently bearing witness. Derek leaned in slightly, not threatening, not cruel, just intentional. And just so you know, he said, voice lowered, words measured, I still would have let you sit here. Cale blinked, confused. It's the seat beside me, Derek finished. That was the problem. Cale recoiled an inch, as if the air had pressed in. His hand fumbled for his phone, trying to pretend to scroll, but the screen had dimmed to black. He tapped it nervously, but it no longer held his attention, or anyone else's. Across the aisle, the young boy slowly sat upright, no longer hiding behind his father's shoulder. His eyes never left Derek. His mouth moved, forming words only his father could hear. And suddenly, the cabin wasn't just watching a man embarrassed. They were witnessing a power shift unfold in silence. Cale turned toward the window, trying to disappear into the clouds outside. But the reflection in the glass showed him everything he'd tried to deny. He didn't steal my seat, Cale thought, fists clenched beneath the tray table. He exposed his own place. Mr. Langston. The voice came low and urgent from just over Derek's shoulder. He turned, eyes narrowing slightly as a clean-shaven flight attendant leaned close. The man's posture was brisk, slightly hunched to stay discreet, but his voice held a practiced calm. We've received a ground request for you, urgent. Derek didn't flinch. Proceed. The attendant extended a sleek tablet, the screen already active. Derek's fingers moved with practiced ease as he read the short message from Wade, his executive assistant. Sir, Gulfstream has landed ahead of schedule. Waiting at East Hangar 4. Shall I authorize redirect? His thumb hovered only a second before tapping. Yes. Quietly, Cale, seated stiffly beside him, tilted his head and squinted at the screen. What's this now? He asked, suspicion riding his voice. There was no real curiosity in it, just the nagging urge of a man sensing something slipping out of his control. Derek didn't answer. He simply locked the tablet and passed it back to the attendant with a polite nod. But the brief moment hadn't gone unnoticed. Two passengers in the row behind them exchanged glances. The whisper of something different was beginning to creep through the cabin. Seconds later, the overhead speaker chimed, followed by the pilot's calm voice, filtered through static and altitude. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received a request for immediate ground transfer for one of our first-class passengers. We kindly ask that all travelers remain seated upon arrival until the airport vehicle has cleared the area. Thank you for your cooperation. The announcement fell like a stone into the still air. Cale blinked. Wait, is that for you? His voice cracked slightly, revealing more than he meant to. He leaned forward to catch a glimpse of Derek's face. Derek didn't nod. He didn't answer. He only offered a measured smile, the kind that neither confirmed nor denied, but erased the need for either. Cale's mouth hung open a fraction, and his eyes darted toward the window like he expected to see some kind of mistake forming in real time. But what he saw instead, just as the wheels kissed the runway, was a black vehicle with Ariontech insignia waiting directly beside the taxi path, escorted by two airport officials. Inside the cabin, the quiet became uneasy. First-class passengers turned in their seats. A man at the front slowly lowered his magazine. Someone across the aisle murmured, "That's his logo." And suddenly, Cale wasn't just annoyed, he was exposed. The wheels rolled to a stop. The seatbelt signs blinked off. But no one moved. A uniformed member of the airport ground team stepped on board, spoke briefly with the lead attendant, and then made his way down the aisle with surgical focus. When he reached Derek's row, he gave a professional nod. "Mr. Langston, your jet is fueled and waiting. This way, sir." Cale instinctively shrank into his seat, watching the interaction with growing disbelief. Derek rose slowly, gathering his bag with unhurried precision. Every motion was deliberate, controlled. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look flustered. He looked like a man who knew exactly when to leave and why everyone else stayed behind. Cale turned toward him, voice low, half-choked. "You have a jet?" Still no answer. Derek stepped into the aisle, but instead of immediately following the escort, he turned to Cale, leveling his gaze like a quiet weight. "You were so eager to take my seat," he said softly, voice even and calm. "You never wondered where I was headed next." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The aisle parted for him as if rehearsed. No one stood. No one spoke. Just a trail of quiet realization that followed his steps all the way to the aircraft door. Outside, the wind caught the edge of his coat, and the night was lit by the steady glow of tarmac floodlights. The vehicle door opened smoothly as Derek approached, its black exterior mirrored in the polished engine of his waiting Verilon GX9 just beyond the fence. The co-pilot nodded. "Timing worked out, sir." Derek offered only a faint smile as he stepped inside. Behind him, through the oval window of seat 2B, Trevor Cale sat frozen, lips parted, chest hollow, watching the man he had dismissed, now walking into a jet that he owned. Sometimes the seat they steal is far below the destination you own. The door of the commercial jet hissed open with a mechanical sigh as Derek Langston stepped down onto the tarmac. The wind, crisp with coastal bite, lifted the collar of his charcoal gray suit like a whisper of warning or promise. But Derek didn't pause. He moved with the calm certainty of someone who had waited precisely long enough. Before him, bathed in the glow of floodlights, the obsidian-colored Virulon GX9 shimmered like a sleeping beast ready to roar. Its lines were clean, aerodynamic, elegant. And beneath the sleek surface, twin hybrid engines built by his own company, Arion Tech. This was no rented luxury. This was his legacy on wings. The co-pilot descended from the jet, clipboard in hand, eyes respectful but alert. "Apologies for the delay, sir," he said, voice barely audible above the hum of turbines. "Refueling finished early in Greystone Bay. She's ready when you are." Derek gave a brief nod. Perfect timing. He climbed the short set of stairs, ducking into the cabin. The interior was silent and still, save for the quiet thrum of power ready to launch. As he sank into the leather seat near the cockpit partition, he pulled out his phone, thumb already tapping in a call. Back on the commercial aircraft, silence took on a new meaning. Cale hadn't moved. His face had shifted from red-hot anger to pale confusion. He sat slouched in 2B like a man trying to disappear inside himself. Around him, the atmosphere had thickened, not with turbulence, but with whispers. "Did you see that jet? He owns it." "No way. I think that was his company's logo on the car." Phones were already out. A man in row 3 angled his camera discreetly. The kid across the aisle didn't even blink, just stared as if witnessing a live broadcast of a parable. The boy's father leaned close, voice barely above a breath. "He might be a billionaire," he said. The boy nodded slowly, as if understanding something about value for the first time. Inside the private vehicle en route to the hangar, Derek pressed the phone to his ear. Wade picked up on the second ring. "Push the Faro Heights meeting back 30 minutes, Derek said, eyes on the runway vanishing behind him. "I want to arrive with clarity." "Already handled," Wade replied efficiently. Then a pause. "Also, there's a video." Derek's brow tightened, though his voice remained even. "What video?" Wade hesitated, choosing his words. "Someone recorded Cale on the plane. His comments. It's circulating fast. Captioned something like, 'CEO stays calm while insulted in first class.' You're trending." Derek leaned his head back, letting the words settle like a pressure change in the cabin. He didn't need to ask what the clip contained. The truth had a way of leaking even when no one intended it. He sighed once, soft but decisive. "Let it trend," he said. "Just make sure Cale's name stays out, for now." "Understood," Wade replied, but even he sounded uncertain. Because the truth was, Cale's voice had already been captured. It rang loud in the recording, every mocking word, every condescending tone. The camera hadn't just caught a moment. It had caught Cale's reflection without filter or excuse. In the glow of the runway lights, Derek glanced at the dark horizon. There was no victory in this, not in the usual sense. No triumph in humiliating a man too blind to see past his own pride. But there was clarity, the kind of clarity that doesn't come from retaliation, but from restraint. Behind the sealed doors of the commercial jet, Cale stared at the empty seat beside him, the one he had fought for as if it were a throne. But thrones mean nothing when the crown belongs elsewhere. As Derek's jet prepared for takeoff, the runway lights blurred behind them like falling stars. Sometimes silence is the most permanent witness. The tablet in Derek's hand dimmed to black as he tapped it shut, letting the quiet hum of the jet cabin settle around him. But his mind remained far from the glowing leather seats or the polished walnut table at his side. The altitude didn't match his mood. It was lower, heavier, sharpened by what he'd just witnessed back on that flight. He wasn't replaying the insults Cale had thrown. He was reviewing something more valuable: exposure. Derek reached across the table and opened his laptop. The secure Ariontech dashboard sprang to life, his fingers already typing. He searched, Trevor Cale. A few seconds later, a corporate profile loaded. It showed a confident man in his mid-50s, arms crossed in front of a sleek glass building, his title stamped boldly below. Senior Director of Systems Procurement, Veltrix Holdings. Derek blinked once, then leaned back, the realization pressing in. Trevor Cale wasn't just a rude stranger on a flight. He was a decision-maker. And more importantly, he was one of the upper-level liaisons assigned to Veltrix, a tech firm currently competing for a procurement contract with Ariontech. The very contract Derek had been evaluating over the past 2 weeks. His expression didn't change, but his fingers resumed moving. He opened a secure chat with his assistant. Derek, pull full background on Veltrix Holdings. Include ethics history. Flag all correspondence involving Cale. The reply came seconds later. Wade, on it. Also, incident already circulating. Derek didn't respond to that yet. His eyes lingered on Cale's profile photo. The irony felt almost surgical. Cale, of all people, should have known who he was sitting next to. Not because Derek wanted recognition, but because, in the world of contracts and innovation, ignorance came with a price tag. Across the jet, the co-pilot peeked in. Everything smooth, sir? Derek nodded absently. Just turbulence from the ground. Back in the terminal of Crestline Regional Airport, Cale stepped onto the concourse like a man walking into sudden winter. The temperature hadn't changed, but the air around him felt denser, charged. Gate agents whispered. A security officer glanced twice. Even a janitor paused mid-sweep. He didn't know it yet, but the storm had landed long before the jet wheels had. Cale pulled out his phone. It buzzed immediately. 5 missed calls, 17 texts, dozens of notifications. One group chat was blinking. Executive Club internal. He tapped it. The first message hit him in the chest. Tony D. Trevor. Is this you in this video? Below it was a thumbnail. He clicked it. The footage opened with Derek seated calmly in 2A. Cale's own voice echoed through the clip. Too loud. Too smug. You people always try to upgrade yourselves. Another line, clearer now. Let real people sit up here. The video paused at the moment Derek rose without a word, calmly gathering his bag as a black vehicle waited on the tarmac. Cale's throat tightened. His own voice had become evidence. His own posture, mockery. And the internet had already decided the verdict. He turned slowly in the terminal, suddenly aware that he was being watched. Not by security. Not by fans. By strangers with opinions forming like weather fronts, cold, fast, and irreversible. One younger man held up his phone and whispered something to another. Cale turned and walked faster toward the exit, heart pounding. Back in the jet, Wade's voice came through the satellite phone. We just got the full Veltrix portfolio. 3 minor ethics flags in the last 6 years, mostly ignored. But Cale's name appears on 2 of them. Derek didn't react outwardly. Flag the file. Full report to legal. I want options by morning. Wade continued, voice measured. Also, sir, the video. It's exploding. Cross-platform traction, global shares. Trending as, man mocks black CEO. Doesn't know he owns a jet. Derek closed his laptop and leaned back. His face stayed composed, but his eyes hardened. Not in anger, in resolve. He knew what this meant, not for his reputation, which could handle the storm, but for the choices ahead. Cale had unknowingly turned a moment of quiet insult into a litmus test for leadership. Derek didn't have to push. The world had seen everything. And more importantly, so had Cale. Wade spoke again, quieter now. Should we issue a response? A statement? Derek shook his head slowly, as if speaking to the air. Not yet. Let the wind carry the truth first. Cale sat alone in his car now, still in the airport parking structure. He scrolled through hundreds of comments. Some mocking, others furious, a few even sympathetic, but none blind. His voice in the video was undeniable. His words didn't just insult, they defined him. He pressed his forehead to the steering wheel, eyes shut tight. In that moment, he realized the danger hadn't come from being caught. It had come from being seen. It wasn't just the world that saw him, it was his own reflection in public. The moment Derek Langston's polished shoes touched the tarmac of Faro Heights Executive Terminal, his phone vibrated again. Another alert. The video had just crossed 2.1 million views. He didn't pause to open it. A sleek black sedan, already idling, awaited him a few steps away. The driver opened the door with a silent nod. Inside, Derek sat upright, one leg crossed neatly over the other, his mind already transitioning from the flight to the boardroom. At the towering glass structure of Stelvor Industries, he was expected. The receptionist greeted him with a deferential tone, and within minutes, he was in the elevator, ascending toward one of the most critical meetings of the fiscal year. As the floor number ticked up, Derek reviewed key points mentally. Market value alignment, joint patent clauses, transition oversight, but the image of Trevor Cale's face, flushed, trembling, falsely composed, still flickered in the back of his mind. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open to reveal a boardroom lined with panoramic windows. Early afternoon sun painting angular shadows across a marble table. 6 men stood waiting, all in sharp suits. At the head sat Halloran Fisk, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, a founding partner of Stelvor. Halloran smirked as Derek approached. "Heard you had an eventful flight." Derek simply returned the smile, setting his leather folder on the table. "Only from seat 2A to 40,000 feet. A low chuckle rippled around the room. Halloran leaned back, folding his hands. "Then let's make sure the landing's smooth." With that, they got to business. Across town, and across a digital battlefield, Trevor Cale's world had started to collapse. His phone buzzed uncontrollably. Notifications stacked like bricks, burying him in reminders of a mistake that had gone viral. He had tried everything, flagging the original upload, reporting parodies, even messaging the account that first posted it. But the internet had moved too fast. The video now existed in dozens of forms: short reels, stitched commentaries, re-edits with cinematic music, frame-by-frame breakdowns by self-proclaimed corporate behavior analysts. One clip zoomed in on the exact moment Derek leaned in and whispered, "You never wondered where I was headed next." Another freeze-framed Cale's expression afterward with captions like, "When you realize you disrespected the wrong man." Cale's group chats weren't any kinder. One from a coworker read, "Trevor bro, is that you?" Another said, "That jet though." A third just sent a popcorn emoji and a link to the trending hashtag #JetJustice. Emails from Veltrix's HR department were now coming in with increasing urgency. His boss's message, stamped at 9:07 a.m., read, "Need to talk tomorrow. Urgent. Bring context." The phrase felt ominous. Context? What context could fix what the world had already decided? Cale's reflection in the airport restroom mirror was unfamiliar. Hair unkempt, collar wilted, skin pale. The man who once strutted into boardrooms with artificial dominance now looked like a student called to the principal's office. But this wasn't school. It was corporate warfare, and he had just handed his enemy the high ground on camera. He stared at the sink. Cold water rushed over his hands, but it did nothing to cool the rising anxiety in his chest. The silence after his words on that plane kept playing in his head. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence that followed a verdict. That eerie stillness after a gavel drops, when you realize it was your own hand that lowered it. Meanwhile, across from Stelvor's executive wing, Derek finished outlining Ariontech's integration plan. His voice never rose. His cadence never faltered. He didn't mention the flight. Not once. But even in that boardroom, the ripple of it was felt. One junior advisor whispered to another when Derek stepped out for a break, "Did you see the video?" The other nodded, eyes wide. Power move of the year. And he didn't even raise his voice. Outside, Derek leaned on the railing of a private terrace, eyes scanning the Faro Heights skyline. The sun dipped lower, casting the city in amber. His phone vibrated again. This time, a message from Wade. Update, video trending globally. Multiple news outlets requesting interviews. Segment name forming. The quietest power move ever. Derek typed a brief reply. Ignore for now. Monitor tone. Let silence speak. He slipped the phone back into his coat pocket, then exhaled slowly. A gust of wind tugged at the edge of his jacket, but he stood still, calm, composed. Cale's actions had created a storm, but Derek wasn't caught in it. He had simply risen above, and far away, in a dimly lit apartment, Cale sat hunched over his laptop, watching the freeze frame of himself on the flight screen, his mouth half open, his hand mid-gesture. Derek walking away. The comments scrolled endlessly beneath it. Bro really tried it. You can't fake class. You either have it or you don't. That's what quiet dignity looks like. Cale's hand trembled as he reached for his charger. But his phone buzzed again before he could plug it in. Another message. From someone he hadn't heard from in years. Is that you in the plane video? He closed the lid of the laptop. The room felt too quiet now. The kind of silence that didn't comfort, it accused. Not loud, not cruel, but unrelenting. The echo of Derek's final glance, measured, wordless, complete, played one last time in Cale's mind before sleep would avoid him for yet another night. He hadn't just lost his seat, he'd lost his place in the story. He smirked, sat down, and told the black CO to try economy. As the cabin went silent. If you believe true power doesn't need to argue, hit subscribe now. Because dignity flies higher than ego ever could. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, but the silence that followed felt heavier than steel. Trevor Cale stepped into the executive floor of Veltrix Holdings with the gait of a man carrying invisible weights. His usually sharp suit was wrinkled, the collar slightly wilted, as if the night hadn't offered him sleep but interrogation. His eyes were bloodshot, not just from exhaustion but from dread, the kind that creeps into your throat and doesn't leave room to breathe. The glass walls of the executive wing reflected fragments of his image as he passed, twisted, distorted, like his reputation over the past 12 hours. No one greeted him. Even the receptionist, who usually nodded with forced cheer, kept her gaze low. Every footstep echoed longer than it should have. The lobby too quiet, too sterile. At the end of the hall, Grant Aller's door was already ajar. The senior vice president of global strategy rarely left it open. Today was an exception. Cale knocked once out of habit, then stepped in. Grant didn't rise, didn't offer a handshake, just gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit, he said. Cale obeyed without a word. On the large monitor behind Grant's desk, the video played on loop, muted but unmistakable. The grainy footage showed Cale on the plane, lips moving, hands gesturing in agitation. Across from him, Derek Langston sat silent, calm, unmoved. Each replay deepened the bruise Cale already felt forming in the core of his reputation. I don't care about optics, Grant began, eyes still on the screen, voice sharp and clipped. I care about the $600 million contract we were about to close with Arion Tech. Cale swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he tried to interject. I didn't know who he was. That's the problem, Grant snapped, finally turning to face him. His glare was sharp enough to cut through the glass table between them. You judged before knowing. You treated a man like he was beneath you on camera. You embarrassed this company before a global client. Cale's hands curled into fists in his lap. His voice lowered to a desperate hush. Can we apologize? Issue a statement? I'll go public. Grant exhaled through his nose and sat back, fingers steepled. He hasn't said a word publicly. Not a single quote. Not a single post. And yet, he pointed to the screen where the video had shifted to a reaction clip, an influencer breaking down the incident frame by frame. Every word you said is replaying worldwide. The silence stretched long enough for Cale to hear the faint ticking of Grant's desk clock. Each second felt like a verdict. People are calling it a case study in how not to act in corporate leadership, Grant continued. You weren't just rude. You made your ego our liability. Cale's face twitched. His world, once composed of strategy sessions, cocktail fundraisers, and handshakes with senators, was cracking. What do you want me to do? He asked. Tell me what to fix. Grant rose from his chair. The decision had already been made. Effective immediately, you're on leave. HR will reach out to finalize the details. Cale stood, shoulders slumped. He didn't even retaliate. Grant walked around the desk, stopping just inches from Cale. His tone softened, but only slightly. He didn't have to. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing with finality. You proved everything by yourself. Cale didn't respond. He turned, walked out of the office, and passed through the same sterile hallway. Only now, every pane of glass felt like a mirror. Reflections of the man he thought he was warping. As he stepped into the lobby, 2 junior associates passed him. One whispered to the other, unaware or uncaring that he could still hear. That's the guy from the plane. Cale didn't look back. Sometimes, consequences arrive quietly, but they land harder than any jet. The office door clicked shut behind Wade as he stepped into Derek Langston's executive suite, the soft sound barely rising over the hush of the floor-to-ceiling windows behind the CEO. Outside, the skyline of Arkenton buzzed faintly in the distance, blurred by the double-glazed glass and tinted light. Wade's face was composed, but his grip on the folder in his hand was tight, professional, yes, but not without weight. He walked across the matte black floor and laid the folder gently on Derek's desk. Final update on Veltrix, he said, his voice measured but direct. They've placed Trevor Cale on indefinite leave. The board's calling for a full reevaluation of their proposal. Derek didn't look up at first. His fingers rested lightly against the rim of a coffee mug, untouched. For a moment, the silence between them felt stretched thin. Then, slowly, he reached for the folder, opened it, and scanned the contents without flinching. Good, he said finally, his voice even. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted responsibility. He closed the folder and set it aside with a quiet finality. Wade hesitated, then added, Also, your silence made it louder. Everyone's talking about how you didn't say anything, and still made the point. Derek turned his head toward the skyline, eyes narrowing just slightly, as though focusing past the glass and into memory. I didn't have to say anything, he murmured. He said it all for me. The 2 men stood in a shared stillness. Wade didn't press further, but his presence didn't move either. The tension hadn't vanished. It had shifted. Gone were the sparks of confrontation. What remained was the low hum of consequence settling into place. Derek turned back to his desk and tapped a key on his digital console. Where are we on the alternative vendor? He asked. Wade's lips curved, just faintly. Vailron Systems is ready. Their ethics score is higher. Technology's stronger. Price came in 15% below Veltrix. He paused, adding with a smirk, and no one from their team tried to lecture you about seat assignments. Derek exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh, but it never fully formed. Let's move forward with Vailron. Quietly, Wade nodded, the sharp professionalism returning to his posture. He turned to leave but stopped halfway. There's one more thing. It came in this afternoon. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a small envelope. No logo, no return address, just plain paper sealed by hand. Wade handed it to Derek like it might carry heat. Derek opened it slowly. Inside was a single white card, thick stock, no ornament. Just 6 words in neat, unshaking handwriting. I was wrong. I'm sorry. TK. For a long moment he said nothing, just looked at the note. The desk lamp caught the curves of the ink, and in that light, the humility was almost visible. But Derek didn't frown. He didn't smile either. He folded the card neatly, placed it back into the envelope, and slid it into the top drawer of his desk. No label, no note to follow up, just silence. Wade said nothing. He simply watched the drawer close. Then Derek spoke, voice low, composed. Some lessons don't need to be returned, just remembered. The cameras were already rolling when Derek Langston took his seat in the soundproof studio of the Novaline Leadership Summit. The room was cloaked in soft gray panels and engineered silence, broken only by the distant hum of tech equipment. Lights glowed gently from the ceiling, casting a warm focus on the sleek glass table between Derek and his interviewer. Across from him sat Malcolm Wren, a sharp-featured man in his early 40s with a reputation for coaxing truth from titans. He leaned forward, resting his hands calmly over his tablet, eyes locked on Derek. "Mr. Langston," Malcolm began, his voice level but direct. "That flight video, everyone's seen it by now. Millions of views. You were insulted, recorded, and practically went viral overnight. What I think the world really wants to know is, why didn't you respond?" The studio hung silent for a breath. Derek folded his hands. "No fidetin. Just presence." His voice, when it came, was calm but layered with something deeper. Not detachment, clarity. "Because not every insult deserves oxygen," he said. "Some correct themselves when left exposed." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. The phrase intrigued him, but he wasn't about to let it end there. "But don't you think speaking out could have taught a louder lesson? Set a precedent, maybe?" Derek tilted his head slightly, as if measuring the question from different angles before answering. "Sometimes," he replied, "silence teaches the loudest." He leaned in, locking eyes with Malcolm. "There was a boy sitting across the aisle from me. Watched the whole thing. Didn't blink. You know what he saw? That I didn't need to yell to prove anything. That keeping your place, quietly, is sometimes the most powerful answer." Malcolm studied him for a moment. "And you think that moment had more weight because you chose not to speak?" "It wasn't just weight," Derek said, his tone sharpening just enough to demand stillness in the room. "It was permission, for that boy, for anyone watching, to not react just because someone expects you to." The director behind the glass tapped the signal. The production team was already marking the segment clearly. This was going to be one of the summit's highlights. But Derek wasn't performing. There was no script, no dramatic pause for applause, only lived experience, and the calm force that came from knowing he had handled the storm with his hands in his lap. Behind the camera, Wade, Derek's assistant, sat watching the feed from a control monitor. He scrolled through live market trackers on his phone. Arion Tech stock had surged another 2% during the broadcast. The broader trend had begun days ago, but investors now saw the pattern for what it was. A quiet, consistent rise built not from speeches, but from poise. The incident on the plane had set fire to the internet, but Derek had never addressed it publicly. No tweet, no press release, no op-ed in a major paper. And yet, the silence itself had become a statement, one interpreted and amplified by every commentator, every leadership blog, every youth mentorship network suddenly quoting his restraint like scripture. Malcolm wasn't finished. "Do you think power," he asked carefully, "has something to do with patience?" Derek gave a soft laugh, not at the question, but at how rarely anyone asked it. "Patience isn't weakness," he said. "It's restraint with direction. You can't always stop a storm," he added, "but you can choose how to stand in it." Malcolm looked down, then back up. "And that boy you mentioned, he'll remember?" "He already has," Derek said. Outside the studio, journalists lingered. Tech bloggers typed furiously in lounges, waiting for quotes to hit the wire. One of them had already titled their upcoming piece, "Leadership in Stillness, the Langston Approach." But inside the booth, Derek's words lingered longer than any headline. "Not every seat must be defended," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "Some simply reveal who was always flying the plane." The phone rang once, twice, then a third time before finally clicking over. "I saw the video." Cale froze where he stood, halfway through clearing out his office shelf. The voice was unmistakable, gravelly, composed, and as familiar as it was heavy with disappointment. "His father." "Dad," Cale started, his throat dry. "Is that who you've become?" The question wasn't shouted. It wasn't even bitter. It was surgical, sharp, and cold, like someone diagnosing a wound too deep for stitching. Cale blinked at the empty air of his apartment, surrounded by unopened mail and half-drunk coffee. "It was a misunderstanding," he said quickly, voice tight with practiced regret. He didn't look like, I didn't know who. The silence on the line was worse than any reply. Then, at last, "No." It was a revelation. Click. Cale stood for a long moment, phone still pressed to his ear even as the call disconnected. Then he lowered it, staring blankly at the wall across the room, the one that used to hold his framed photo with the Veltrix board at a tech summit in Berlin. He had taken it down yesterday. Everything was falling in slow motion. The past week had turned his name into a punchline. What started with quiet whispers had erupted into full-blown scrutiny. That video had circled the globe in less than 24 hours. At first, he thought the story would fade. A misunderstanding, he told himself. A moment taken out of context. But context was no match for clarity. The footage was unmistakable. Him sneering down at Derek Langston. His voice sharp, his face smug, his words venomous. "You people always try to upgrade yourselves. Let real people sit up here." And then the cut to Derek sitting silent, dignified, composed. Not even flinching. Not even defending himself. Just waiting. Watching. The whole world had seen it. Now they were dissecting it. Podcasts picked it apart. Commentators replayed every line. One viral clip zoomed in on Cale's posture. How he had leaned back arrogantly, eyes half-lidded, smiling like a man used to being the most important person in the room. Twitter analysts called it the posture of entitlement. Others layered piano music beneath Derek's final walk off the plane and labeled it the exit heard around the net. Cale shut his laptop. It didn't matter what he tried to control now. His name was already Google poison. He sat down at the edge of his bed, scrolling through emails on his phone. Half had subject lines like, "Clarification needed" or "Quick call today." But they weren't about curiosity. They were distancing maneuvers. One by one, his calendar meetings began vanishing, like raindrops evaporating under heat. Clients stopped responding. Industry acquaintances who once texted, "Happy to connect anytime," had gone radio silent. The knock at the door startled him. It was Drew, his neighbor from 2 floors down. A quiet guy, finance consultant, rarely said more than 5 words in the hallway. Cale opened the door cautiously. "Hey," Drew said, shifting his weight awkwardly. "Look, I just wanted to say, I saw that flight thing." His voice was neutral, but his eyes carried a cautious distance. Cale waited for the blow, but Drew just nodded once. That was rough. Then he turned and left. Not that was unfair. Not people overreacted. Just rough. Cale shut the door slowly. The air inside felt denser than before. He walked back into the kitchen and opened the cabinet, reaching for a glass. His hand trembled. He stopped and stared at his reflection in the microwave door. Unshaven, eyes sunken, collar wrinkled. He picked up his phone again, typed in Trevor Cale into the search bar. The first autocomplete result? Trevor Cale plane meltdown. Second? Entitled man humiliates himself in first class. Third? Flight lesson in silence. CEO versus loudmouth. His fingers hovered over the screen. Cale deleted the Twitter app, then LinkedIn, then Instagram. Then he opened his email and began writing a resignation letter. But stopped. There was no point. Veltrix hadn't formally terminated him, but the writing was everywhere. When he had arrived at the office earlier that day, the receptionist hadn't even looked up. His access badge still worked, but his office had been cleared of sensitive materials. Grant Aller, his boss, had already told him, "We're placing you on leave. HR will coordinate the next steps." Steps toward what? Redemption? Cale had tried applying to smaller companies, hoping his resume would speak louder than the headlines. But even then, replies were slow, hesitant, if they came at all. He looked around his apartment again. The bookshelf still had titles like The Strategic Mind, How to Lead When You're Losing Command Presence. He laughed bitterly. The chair he'd stolen from another man was now symbolic, mocked in memes, quoted in think pieces, taught in business ethics classes. The seat snatcher, they called him, and they weren't wrong, because in that moment on that plane, he had shown the world everything about himself, without ever meaning to. Now he couldn't run from it, couldn't cover it, couldn't outtalk it. The door to the future wasn't just closed. It was locked from the inside, and worst of all, he had handed over the key. He sank into the couch and stared blankly at the ceiling. He hadn't just lost altitude. He'd crashed into a lesson no jet could outfly. "You were across from me?" Derek said as the boy stepped cautiously into the Ariontech headquarters lobby, his small sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. The ceiling stretched 2 stories high, steel beams arched above glass-paneled walls, and a model of Ariontech's first hybrid jet turbine spun slowly inside a suspended display case. Miles Thale stood just inside the entryway, eyes wide, unsure whether he was supposed to move forward or just keep taking it in. He clutched his father's hand tightly. His father, Conrad Thale, a regional high school science teacher, had driven through 2 counties to get here, confused but curious after receiving Derek Langston's direct invitation. Derek didn't waste time with fanfare. He had watched the security footage from the flight more than once, not to relive Cale's insults, but to study the boy's gaze. Miles hadn't looked away once. That mattered. "I saw you," Miles said softly, his voice uncertain but honest. "I mean, I saw everything." Derek crouched to meet him at eye level. "Then you saw how quiet sometimes speaks louder than noise." Miles nodded slowly. "Why didn't you yell back?" Derek tilted his head, studying the boy's face, a mix of wonder and confusion. "Because some people listen louder when you whisper," he said, his voice low, steady. Miles blinked. That answer landed somewhere deep in him, a place he didn't yet know how to explain. Conrad stepped forward, hesitant. "Mr. Langston, we really didn't expect this. I didn't even think the message was real." Miles didn't sleep all week. He thought it was a mistake. Derek rose and extended a hand. "Not a mistake. I tracked you down deliberately. The way your son watched everything. I've seen that look before. On engineers before they build something. On pilots before they take off." He reached into his suit jacket and handed the boy a small, black box. Miles opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a miniature turbine model, etched with the Ariontech insignia and a quote engraved in brushed silver. "Leadership is how you sit, not just where." Miles stared at it like it was a key to something invisible. Conrad exhaled deeply, holding back emotion. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice roughening. "I know," Derek replied. "But maybe he'll remember it before someone else forgets their place." He turned, motioning to the corridor that led deeper into the innovation campus. "Come. Let me show you both the future we're building here. Maybe it'll be one he helps shape." As they walked past display labs filled with prototype drones and sustainability pods, Miles asked thoughtful questions, not about the machines but about the choices behind them. "Why do you use recycled titanium for the outer rings? Why doesn't everyone use solar augmentation like you do? Did you build any of these after that day on the plane?" Derek answered each one without hesitation, impressed not just by the questions, but by the tone. Curious, respectful, awake. At one point, they stood in front of a large curved window that overlooked the wind tunnel test site. Derek placed a hand on Miles's shoulder. "Every plane you've ever seen starts here, in a quiet room, with someone watching, listening, imagining." Miles nodded. "Like I was watching you?" "Exactly." The tour ended an hour later. No press. No headlines. No trending videos. Just 3 people who'd crossed paths through an unplanned moment of ugliness, and chosen not to leave it there. As Conrad buckled Miles into the passenger seat of their modest car outside the campus, he turned to Derek once more. "This will change him," he said. "He won't forget this." "I hope not," Derek replied. "And I hope he remembers why it mattered." The car pulled away slowly, leaving Derek standing alone under the fading sun, wind brushing his collar like it had on the tarmac that day. He didn't need the world to know what just happened. He only needed Miles to remember. That moment never made the headlines. It didn't trend. But to Miles, it became the reason he later applied for Tech's youth engineering program. Because one man didn't move when they told him to, I learned where I belong. The applause thundered before the first word was spoken. Derek Langston stood center stage beneath the polished arch of Tech's newly unveiled aerospace headquarters, a cathedral of glass and steel engineered by the very minds he had mentored. Lights caught the angles of his grayed temples and dignified frame, but his expression remained composed. The crowd quieted as he adjusted the single microphone in front of him. Invention is often defined by what we create, he began, voice steady, the room holding its breath. But legacy is defined by who remembers why it was created. The audience leaned in, drawn by something deeper than ceremony. This wasn't just a corporate milestone. It was a return to something remembered, but not yet resolved. In the front row, seated with a lanyard that read Youth Engineering Scholar Class of 2030, was Miles Thale, now 18, taller, confident, but eyes still full of that awe Derek remembered from the aisle seat years ago. He watched Derek intently, shoulders squared beneath a simple navy suit. Derek's gaze drifted to him, and for a second, the sound in the hall dulled to a hush in his own mind. He was there, Derek said, nodding subtly toward Miles. He didn't just see me hold my seat. He saw me hold my ground. There was a murmur in the audience. Not confusion, but recognition. Some knew the story. Others had only seen the clip, the flight, the walk-off. But now they saw the outcome in the flesh. Miles, a boy who'd once been a silent witness, now the first of many mentored under a program born from restraint, not revenge. Backstage, engineers, executives, and interns watched from monitors, each one pausing in their tasks. One of them, an intern named Riley, whispered to a colleague, "That's the kid from the story, right?" The other just nodded, eyes on the screen. Across the country, in a modest, quiet tech office dimmed by drawn blinds, another man watched too. Trevor Cale sat at his desk, lit only by the blue hue of his monitor. He wore no tie. His badge read Senior Systems Analyst, Level 2. No titles. No brass plaques. Just a name. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't speak as Derek's speech echoed through the livestream feed. Didn't blink much either. Just stared, shoulders still, jaw faintly tense, eyes betraying something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Derek's voice carried on through the screen. We often underestimate the impact of how we sit in a moment, how we carry ourselves when no one claps, when no one agrees. But sometimes, he paused, letting the weight of silence sit with everyone. Sometimes the smallest action in the narrowest space becomes the reason someone else finds their path. The camera panned slowly toward Miles, who lowered his gaze, not out of shame, but out of reverence. In his hand, just visible, was the small turbine model from years ago. The one with the engraving, "Leadership is how you sit, not just where." Derek saw it too. His voice softened, but his eyes sharpened. He didn't just witness a moment. He inherited it. And in doing so, he reminds all of us why we build. Not just machines, but trust, endurance, and dignity. A standing ovation rose like a tide. But Derek didn't react immediately. He simply turned back toward Miles, stepped down from the podium, and shook his hand in front of everyone. The cameras caught it. The symbolism. The generational handoff. And in that silent tech office, Cale finally leaned back in his chair. He didn't sigh. He didn't shift. He just nodded, slowly, as if the version of himself from years ago had finally caught up. He whispered aloud to no one, voice quiet but certain. The seat I took wasn't the one I needed. It was the one that showed me who I wasn't. Back on stage, Derek returned to the microphone one last time. The room had settled again. Sometimes, the seat they try to steal only reminds the world who it truly belongs to. He stole a seat and froze when a private jet rolled up to the window with the CEO's name on it. If you believe respect is earned, not taken, subscribe now. Because justice always arrives on schedule. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, entitlement, and the eye-opening consequences of judging others by appearance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and the respect every person deserves.